Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. We're back after a short break, so thanks for joining. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in the latest episode, I sat down with Jodi Anhorn and Devin Lacey from GLJ Consulting in Canada to get the Canadian perspective on all things carbon management. We cover topics including the challenges and opportunities around decarbonisation for Canadian companies, as well as the impact of carbon pricing and policy on how companies approach their overall carbon management strategy. We also dive into some of the conversations around LNG, hydrogen, and data centres. If you enjoy our conversation, please like the podcast. And if you want to stay on top of all upcoming episodes, please subscribe to the feed. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Jodi and Devin. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our next episode of Navigating Carbon. Today, I'm really excited. I'm joined by two guests today, which is a first for me. I'm very excited. I'm talking to Jodi Anhorn and Devin Lacey from GLJ Consulting, and we're going to talk all about the Canadian perspective in terms of carbon management and what we're seeing. So, gentlemen, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Deb. Yeah, we're really excited to join you. We're looking forward to this.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it should be fun. So, Jodi, I'll start with you. Do you want to give folks just a little bit of an overview and a background on who GLJ is and what you guys do?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So GLJ, we're based out of Calgary, Alberta. We're an independent consultancy. We've worked with a number of clients over the past 50 years, really in the global energy sector. So, we have a team of about 100 geoscientists, engineers, analysts, business specialists. We really specialize in subsurface resource assessments. That's kind of the roots of the firm, reserves and resources for, 4 of those 5 decades. A lot towards certification, integrated reservoir modeling, and technical studies. We do a lot of work more recently in third-party sustainability services, again, on the consulting front. So, and over those 50 years, we've become a leader a little bit in technical, commercial, regulatory evaluation for emerging subsurface resources. So anything related to CCS, geothermal, lithium, hydrogen, and helium.
Stuff.
We work for all sorts of different oil and gas producers, developers, industrial emitters, financial community, First Nations, government agencies, regulatory, legal firms. So we're very much a client-facing energy consulting company.
Yeah, I love that. And, I think you talked about sort of the evolution as, you're starting to look at all these carbon management things. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into some of the insights that you guys have about, what's going on in Canada and even globally for your clients. So I think, we've talked about, this balance between emission reduction and economics and, coming from that reserve cash flow point of view, I think we all think about this sort of similar in that regard. And so, I'd love you guys to sort of talk about some of the challenges you've seen for folks in Canada, and also sort of how do we think about this maybe in terms of some of the opportunities that also exist in this space? Let's start there.
Yeah, great question. Go ahead.
Well, I just think something we certainly see here in Canada, and I think in other jurisdictions will be able to relate to this, is so much of our policies and incentives geared towards emission reduction or new product diversification. They're very much made by politicians at the federal level. Not to say that there's no industry collaboration there, but I think there's a gap in Canada in terms of how much industry is collaborated with, is involved, and participates with those policies. Because our suite of policies and our suite of the regulatory environment here in Canada can certainly be hard to navigate. Sometimes there's policies sort of contradicting one another and things like that. And you just wouldn't see that as much if industry was brought into the fold more, maybe through public-private partnership, or maybe the provinces take more jurisdiction over these policies than the Fed. I don't know the exact answer, but really it's more of a theme or more of a concept of getting industry more involved, because they're the ones that understand the true economic feasibility of these types of projects and how it impacts cost of supply for end-use consumers and how you get the best bang for your buck in terms of emissions reduction. And those that we industry, the greater we, know those technologies, know how to implement them, know the cost benefit analysis of each. Meanwhile, we always kind of feel like we're chasing the latest political style of policy that's been implemented. So I think sort of greater public-private partnership for us would be a huge benefit because
Yeah.
ultimately industry wants to do these projects. That's something we certainly see on both sides of the border internationally. They want to do these emissions management projects or diversify their portfolio and things like LNG or low carbon fuels or what have you. But ultimately they're trying to figure out where they can do it because those policies are so important, and involving industry up front, I think, would be a huge benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
it's a good point, Devin. You talk about it in terms of opportunity, and that's really the way we kind of see our clients thinking about it, right? They have all these projects they want to move on, but it can be really tough, obviously, if regulations and policy are changing all the time. Like an example we talk about that's been pretty successful here in Alberta is what we call the TIER program. So technology, innovations and emissions reduction. Set up, thank you.
Everything's an acronym,
Yeah,
right?
it's all-
Everything
it's
has
all
to be an acronym.
acronyms. So it was set up in like 2007, very quietly in the background. Like this is almost a decade ahead of Canada's carbon tax. And it's one of the policies that I think the Alberta government did a pretty good job in consultation with industry with. You know, how do we set up a benchmark that if you can't meet, well, then you're, a payer, you're deficient. And if you do meet it, well, then you gain some credits and you get credit in the system. And over time, those bars can be set at different levels to encourage innovation. And it was very, very successful. And so, that's an example of a partnership I think that's worked.
Talked about another one earlier, the methane emissions reduction target that was very much so driven provincially in collaboration with industry. I think the target was to reduce methane emissions by 45% from 2014 levels by 2025, and industry in Alberta did it by 2022 and beat the mark by 3 years because it was a collaborative effort and industry led the way. And honestly, I doubt anyone in the US is aware of that. We barely even talk about it here in Alberta and in Canada, but it's a huge success story. So that industry input, ultimately, they're the ones leading the way in this. And there's examples that we have here provincially that I think we can learn from.
That's really cool. And like, Jodi, going back to that example, like that started in 2007, right? We're sitting here, it's 2025. It talks about, I think we see a lot of like political backlash or, new governments in, there's new policies, like we're going to redo and undo everything they've done and things like that. But like companies don't work on that kind of cycle. So like, talk about some of the challenge for that. Like having stable regulation is just as important as like what that regulation is to a certain extent. So like how have your clients like dealt with some of that challenge of that tension? Like,
well, it's a great question, right? And companies always think in terms of, risks and uncertainty. And companies generally are fine with levels of uncertainty, right? We make an investment, maybe we get a 5% rate of return, maybe we do great, get a 25% rate of return. Risks can be different, right? Risks can be, external to them, things they obviously can't really control. But in some cases, they may ultimately mean you just don't have a project. And that's a real problem for companies. And as you mentioned, these decisions are being made, I'm deciding now to make an FID. Maybe we don't actually start, generating revenue for 5 years or 10 years. And then we operate these assets for decades. So well beyond a political cycle, right? And politics can change so drastically in there. So there has to be some level of certainty and trust that, if I'll use the word bipartisan because it applies in Canada as well as the US, but some level of trust that, there's going to be some strong regulatory frameworks in place that companies can learn to live with and work with to make these long-term decisions. I've got an example later, but it looks like you want to add something on there too.
I keep coming back to this. Like it's not if organizations are looking to invest in emissions management projects or other types of projects, it's where lots of times. It's where based on long-term political stability and who is working with industry and who's empowering industry versus sort of hampering them or penalizing them too heavily to a certain extent. I know, I think we were at a presentation this week and the stat that was used was, and since 2022, there's been 4 CCS FIDs in the US, but internationally there's been 26 during that same period. So clearly operators are looking, or there's proponents looking to invest in these projects. And even though the Inflation Reduction Act on the face of it from a policy perspective has excellent incentive for something like CCS, and it's legislated and it's got relative clarity, even even in the current administration, when it comes to boots on the ground and the regulatory side, trying to gain access to a Class 6 well permit and push those through, there's huge hurdles at the EPA level. So
Yeah.
ultimately, industry has seen that, and it shows in the numbers in terms of capital being deployed elsewhere. And we clearly have that same issue in Canada where, as industry, we want to be fighting for capital investment in Canada for oil and gas, LNG, CCS, geothermal. We're not picky. We know projects here can be successful, so we want them to come here. But where's that? We need that underlying support stability from government, or else they don't just not go ahead. Largely, they go somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, the piece I want to stick with there, Devin, that you're talking about, right? Like you talk about like getting all the right kind of like players, right, in the room, and like things like CO2 pipelines, for example, have faced, even though in terms, in theory, like the general public and everybody and companies should be all thinking that's a great idea because it's going to reduce emissions, we sort of see this same often backlash around infrastructure. And so it's suddenly like trying to figure out how we're having common conversations about emission reduction and what we need to do for that instead of it just being another pipeline. Like have you seen sort of some of those challenges? You talked about how you're seeing groups really working together to get these projects and get the capital over the long term invested. Like, has that been a really big piece to the success of some of these projects?
It's lots of times it's the underlying similarity on the projects that actually have worked over the last 5 to 10 years. So like we can cherry pick a few here in Alberta. I think we talked about the Air Products net zero hydrogen facility FID, multi-billion-dollar FID here for hydrogen petrochemicals in Alberta, and those aren't happening hand over fist. But in their particular case, they had all these sort of synergies and groups that were working together across the value chain, stakeholders that were involved, rights holders that were involved, that they had a project that made sense. And now Albertans get to benefit from a $2 billion facility getting built here and all the jobs that come with that. So that very same project, though, wouldn't have worked if there was something that didn't click within the value chain or something that didn't click within the group of stakeholders. So I think if you start to look at the FIDs that we've seen in different countries for these major projects, lots of times the commonality isn't, oh, they both have great geology, so they both worked, or they both had a great field development plan, so they both worked. It's they had the right group of people in the room early and often, and the synergies sort of presented themselves. Not just not one component of the project makes project go ahead. It's all the different pieces.
Yeah. And really, you started particularly discussing pipelines at the very beginning there. And, it's no surprise that we get pushback on CO2 pipelines just because we've been told for 10 years that pipelines are evil, right? Like it's just been indoctrinated through, education, the media, the pipelines are difficult. You don't want them, et cetera. So even though you come across the CO2 pipeline, which in theory, is very helpful to society in the long run, there's resistance, right? We've had, especially in Canada, we've had a government that's been pretty strongly opposed to just resource development in general. They've, very heavily swung towards the environmental balance, right? Or however you want to think about it. And at the expense, to a large extent, of resource development. And so, as Devin mentioned, that money has moved elsewhere, and it's had its impact on Canada. Like perfect example would be, and this is one that had a funny outcome, is the TMX, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, right? It was proposed by, a public company, private company, right, to build it. They would have been happy to build it and operate it, but they received so much resistance, right, from Indigenous, First Nations, environmental claims. They saw no way around the risk, right? The uncertainty behind it all was just not worth it to them. They were prepared to walk. And so, the Canadian government obviously saw value in this. We were, selling oil at, $10, $20, $30 discounts to what it should have been. So billions of dollars are being lost. So the federal government stepped up, and this was, back in Justin Trudeau's day, and took over the pipeline to get it done because they saw it in the good of the country. And believe me, they didn't want to do that. They knew it was going to cost them politically, and it did. But it was an important decision because the policy had just swung so hard against it. And we have to find a better balance, right? I think the whole thing here is that, there is thoughtful, sustainable resource development to happen here. And that's kind of where we need to get back to, is the proper conversation between the companies and the public interests who are on it. These decisions were just swung too far one way than the other for a little while. especially in Canada.
Yeah. Well, and I think, the piece around, and you talked about, how you're working with clients in like across all sorts of different types of energy and things like that. And it's, again, as we think about producing the energy, which includes oil and gas for, that people need, but doing it with the lowest footprint, getting some of these projects and this capital investment, which isn't small, right? CCUS is not a cheap undertaking. So like, yeah, getting some of that. And to your point around the pipelines, right? Like, how do we change the conversation around energy as well as some of the infrastructure that goes with it as well is a real challenge. So, um, I think one of you mentioned LNG before. Canada's got its first LNG Canada is starting to get up and running. It's been talked about for a long time. Talk about how important that is for the Canadian energy space first, and then we'll sort of dive into some of the carbon aspects and stuff around it.
I mean, to state the obvious within the LNG opportunity, it largely removes two huge constraints that we've had to really producing oil and gas to its full potential in Western Canada, which is transportation and infrastructure constraints and the development of new demand sources right beyond the US or beyond our domestic AGO markets and others. So from that respect, it's a huge opportunity for us to produce a huge resource that we know is readily there and available to be leveraged. So it's an addition for us, not sort of an if, right? It's not like we have to remove gas from our domestic consumers or our US exports. It's we actually can open up the taps on additional resource that is proven and leverage that additional opportunity. So it's a huge economic boost for Canada in general.
Yeah. And
huge boost to the constraints that we've had here in Western Canada from a gas production perspective for decades.
Which is huge. And I think the piece for me that's going to be really interesting to watch in this space is that given the location of LNG Canada on the West Coast, so being much like Pacific facing and very much meeting that Asian demand versus the historical North American LNG through the US going out through the Atlantic and very much serving Europe. And I know I've talked about it before, and Jodi, we've talked about this before as well, of like the EU has a methane directive around fossil fuel imports into Europe. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts about what this like East Coast, West Coast sort of LNG balance in North America might look like, and how are companies thinking about that in terms of the competitiveness of gas because of low carbon and some of these methane directives and some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a great comment. And like we talked about capital going elsewhere. And at some point, you're going to need to access, let's just call it the EU market, the European market in general. And they are very serious, right, about introducing these sort of carbon border adjustments. I'm sure there's another acronym for it, CARB plan or something.
Yeah, there's so many acronyms, it's ridiculous.
Point being, clearly, if you
CVAN,
thank you. That's what it is. But clearly, if you want to access those markets, you have to be delivering, responsibly sourced natural gas product, and North America has that. And certainly, a lot of Canadian operators have been very thoughtful about that over the last 5 or 10 years, to the point where they're becoming certified for that. Their gas does meet those requirements because they want access to that market. So even though in North America, with different jurisdictions doing different rules, these are worldwide commodities, and so we have to think about it that way. If you're going to access those markets, you have to have carbon intensities of X or lower, or you don't get in. And perhaps if you get Y or lower, there's premiums involved. Yeah. So there's carrots there as well. And a lot of the clients we work with are very aware of that, right? And they've been planning for it and they're ready to go. We're blessed in Western Canada, like a lot of the US, with very abundant natural gas, right? I think we're a little light on light oil. We have lots of heavy, but we're light on light oil, but we have lots of natural gas. Like, just take the big elephant in the room for us is the Montney Formation, right? Stretches over 400, 500 miles. We have literally hundreds and hundreds of years of supply that makes sense for us to commoditize it, sell it to communities that truthfully need it, right? Would like a secure and affordable energy source to help them develop, help them get off coal. Like in the long run, look at the US, look at Canada. A large part of our greenhouse reduction emissions over the last 10 years have just come from replacing coal power plants with natural gas. We can do that, right? There's no magic to that. It's just supplying it. And then we can start doing about what's the next best thing, right? We'll worry about the electricity generation with carbon capture and sequestration. That's the next best thing. I mean, none of these are silver bullets on their own, but they're all incremental steps that really matter.
Yeah. No, I love that perspective. And I think it will be really interesting as we start to see again how Asian countries are thinking about, their own footprint and their emissions. They don't have the same sort of detailed regulation that the EU does around fossil fuel imports, but we are hearing and seeing, the Japanese have carbon intensity guidelines for LNG import and other things. So it'll be interesting to see how this very global market, like you said, really kind of plays together. And North America's role in it, both from the Canadian and the US side of it. I'm really interested. Yeah, like I said, I'm fascinated to see how it plays out and how that potentially creates that almost like a competitive carbon environment from a
Honestly.
Yeah.
Like you could see the market play out in somewhere. It's almost like a menu where you've got a carbon intensity and a resulting price, and a better carbon intensity with a little bit of a premium on it. And the countries can decide where they want to bring it in, and they can pay with a little more carbon or pay a little more money. And it would be a healthy market, because then that would drive investment upstream towards reaching those carbon intensities.
Yeah.
And it places an intrinsic value on these big infrastructure and emissions management projects beyond the policies, the sticks and the carrots that government offers, right? There's a competitive quality of product that you need to meet in order to access markets.
Yeah. Well, and then it means that companies can actually start making decisions around where they put their capital because of the return on that. Like if they know they're going to invest in, a methane decarbonization project or a CCUS project, but they can get a better price, again, they can start to factor that into their own risk and uncertainty kind of and cash flow decisions,
right.
Which is huge.
If they trust that market will respond to it, there's some belief in that. Like if we build a plant and your only revenue is going to be claiming, a CO2 credit that may or may not exist from a government source in 5 years or 10 years, that's a huge risk to take on. Different than if it's a market driven incentive that will have some value.
Yeah.
And we talked about this earlier more in the lens of policy is, what are companies thinking about when it comes to capital deployment, long-term planning and things like that. And we kind of took it in a policy direction, but ultimately what we see clients thinking about is true intrinsic value behind these projects, value add products. How can they sort of de-risk long-term, diversify their portfolio, create jobs, create infrastructure, and ultimately sort of monetize these projects by weaning themselves off of policies and incentives. Sure, there needs to be a jurisdiction there that welcomes them and that sort of supports them. But ultimately, if these companies can...
Sorry, I just had a screen blanking here. We'll go back to it. There we go.
Oh. Sorry. Yeah. If these companies can build projects that aren't as reliant on something like a federal carbon price. I mean, an example that comes to mind is even a type of carbon credit that is purchased by private sector, like these carbon dioxide removal or the CDR credits that the Microsofts and the Amazons are looking at, like even beyond just market carbon competitiveness and beyond policy, can you actually come up with, do you have an opportunity to do a project that can earn CDRs on a 15-year offtake from a Microsoft? Like we've seen some of those in Denmark and hopefully here in Canada and some other places that we've worked. But can you introduce that sort of private sector money? And if that CDR is being earned off an RNG stream and it's renewable natural gas, you have an underlying product that you're producing through bioenergy from manure or agricultural waste or what have you, you can really sort of stack these true value add products to do these projects that de-risk and reduce emissions and diversify your portfolio. Yeah. And those are the projects that we really see that tend to have success.
That's really cool. So let's stick with the Microsofts and the data center kind of piece and stuff like that as well. Because LNG is obviously one outlet for gas demand, but the idea of, low carbon gas going in to power data centers, the hydrogen industry is obviously still very early, but, trying to understand what that's going to look like. What are you guys seeing about, some of the demand for sort of non-traditional demand, I guess, for fossil fuels and low carbon fossil fuels, from your clients and in parts of Canada and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, we see and hear lots of conversations about, companies that were previously thinking that just about developing CCS hubs for that purpose, now kind of repurposing a little bit to service data centers, right? There's certainly a large demand for power and data centers. Alberta's a prime location for that. We've got, like we said, years and years of low cost natural gas, which can easily be converted to power. You can sequester carbon while you're doing it. And so there's been a real push to build out a lot of data centers here across the province. You've got some numbers you got on that.
Well, the data center conversation's been front and center through Western Canada and obviously through the States.
Yeah, and
I even saw your alma mater, Deb, S&P, posted an article in the late fall, just kind of forecasting gas demand for power generation to supply different scenarios of data center growth in the US. It was like 3 to 6 BCF a day within that range. And, being up in Canada, whether we have the opportunity to develop data centers here or not, we at least know that growth in demand for natural gas in the US is a huge opportunity for Western Canada production, almost at the sort of type of scale like we're seeing with LNG, like just for scale, the LNG Canada train 1 is approximately 1.9 to 2 BCF a day of input gas requirement. So if train 2 comes online, you're looking at sort of 4 BCF a day, and we have all these other LNG projects in the hopper, Silisms, cedar, wood fiber, and they all kind of add up to potentially 7 BCF a day, 7-ish BCF a day of gas demand, which our current output through Western Canada is about 18 BCF a day. So that's a 40% increase in output requirement here. And then we have the reserves to do it. And you actually look at that sort of data center type of number of gas requirement through the US at sort of 3 on the low end, 6 on the high end. It really is akin to the build out of multiple LNG projects potentially, right? Just to kind of try to compare apples to apples a bit. But those are exciting.
Huge. And,
those are exciting.
you talk about, again, the decisions then that the tech companies that are building these data centers need to make around their own emission footprint of like, okay, are they going to go out and buy carbon credits to offset? Or if they buy lower carbon gas, like, it's again, that balance and it'll be interesting how we see some of these market kind of mechanisms play out.
Maybe you're in the market for a lately used nuclear power plant that you can restart and bring on, right? Like it's the and conversation again. It's really not this or that. I mean, we're an energy hungry civilization. It's literally what's brought us out of the dark ages. So, we can't stop that. It's the question of how do we do it responsibly? And I think it is the and conversation. In some areas like Alberta and, down through the basins, through, Colorado, the Rockies, all the way down through the coast, we're blessed with natural gas and wind and some other resources. Well, we need to use those, right? Clearly we need to use those. Other parts of the world don't have that. So let's export what we can. Hydrogen's hard to export, right? Maybe it is. Maybe LNG is the fuel. And then, locally it's either used to burn or it's used to create other things. Or perhaps it becomes methanol or other products that are maybe more mobile or electrons, right? We just create the digits here and the 0 and run where we've got that supply, and then those are exported. But you have to work with what you've got. It's a question of ultimately physics have to rule here a little bit over politics.
Yeah.
So it goes back to our original point of having more industry collaboration in policy setting, right?
Right.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up, like, I'm really curious, like, what are you guys really excited about? Like, what's on your radar? Like, what's coming next, do you think? Like, really keen for some of those, like, high level kind of like outlooks and thoughts that you guys have. So.
Yeah. You want to go first or you want?
Yeah, I think something that we haven't seen here in a while throughout Canada is sort of widespread public support for energy development and infrastructure development. And that's been front and center here with, tariff news out of the US, sort of obviously hampering our biggest export opportunity. And also we're 3-4 weeks out from our own federal election, which has been, a huge topic of conversation here, to say the least. So what we're seeing is sort of this renewed almost social acceptance or social license in developing energy, oil and gas, and emissions management projects alike. And I think what that to see that, I think I'm hopeful that it'll actually lead to policy amendments or policy creation, or even corporate decisions on the private sector side that that sort of promote more development, right? I think it'll actually be a driver for change at the political and at the board level for both.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of excited to see that swing of momentum.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it is something that, like, yeah, with the elections coming up, and again, maybe tariffs again tomorrow, who knows? Like, maybe not, like it's been back and forth, like you said. How about you, Jodi?
Yeah, I'll double down on that a little bit, because that is certainly a big part of it for me. And I think it's about energy coming back into the conversation in just the general public, right? I kid about it with staff here. We've become a little bit privileged and lucky over the last few decades. We've become disconnected from where our energy comes from, where your water comes from, where your food comes from. People just take it for granted, right? It comes from the wall, and it comes from my tap, and it comes from my, I don't know, where do you grocery shop?
Yeah, I mean, for some of us, it's just like what's in the fridge, right? Like,
Honestly,
and it's not
but,
even
that's
like,
what it is, and it's a good thing. But it's because the generations ahead did all the heavy lifting. They laid all those pipelines for us, and it's coming back again. People are having a real adult conversation about what it takes to build infrastructure that you can rely on and that you can use. So I think that's a big win for us, right? I mean, sure, not everyone needs to be a reservoir engineer, nor should they be, but.
Yeah, cheers.
okay, I am as well. Don't worry.
Yeah, I know. I'm speaking to a soft audience, but either way, I mean, I just understanding the importance of that, I think is just really, it's a healthy conversation for a populace to kind of know it, because all these decisions, they have repercussions, right? And I'm first to say, I think we had good intentions in Canada, but we followed the wrong path for too long without having a balanced conversation, and now that's back.
I love that. Well, I might have to have you guys back on in like a few months once we actually see how some of this stuff all plays out, and see how it's all going and stuff. But Jodi and Devin, thank you so much. It's been so good to get the perspective outside of the US and hearing all about what's going up in Canada. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Right. Yeah, you're very welcome, Deb. That was fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, anytime.